If Jesus was the Messiah, if he truly changed everything, why did the world wake up the next morning looking exactly the same? Rome still ruled, slavery still existed, violence, poverty, power, and cruelty kept going, unchallenged. That's the question nobody likes to sit with, because if the Messiah came to transform the world, and the world didn't transform, then something doesn't add up. Tonight, we're not attacking belief, we're examining a contradiction, and by the end, you'll see why this question quietly unsettles both believers and skeptics alike. Because once you notice it, you can't unsee it. What a Messiah was supposed to do. To understand the problem, we have to begin with expectations, because expectations are the measuring stick of fulfillment. A Messiah was not an abstract idea drifting above history. He was not a metaphor for inner peace or private morality. He was expected to arrive inside the real world, with real consequences that ordinary people could point to and say, "This is different now." In Jewish thought, the Messiah was a public figure shaped by centuries of occupation, exile, and humiliation. People did not pray for symbols when soldiers stood at their doors. They did not long for spiritual metaphors while taxes crushed them and foreign banners flew over their cities. They expected intervention, not inspiration, action, not interpretation. Justice was not meant to be postponed, it was meant to be restored. The Messiah would set things right in visible ways, correcting broken systems rather than comforting individuals inside them. Oppressors would lose power. The vulnerable would be protected. Law would no longer serve the strong at the expense of the weak. Peace would not be a feeling, it would be a condition. This is why foreign rule mattered so much. Rome was not just a political inconvenience, it was daily proof that the world was out of alignment. As long as an empire ruled over the land, the story was unfinished. A true Messiah would not leave that contradiction standing, he would resolve it. This expectation was not fringe or extreme, it was mainstream. It was rooted in scripture, reinforced by history, and fueled by suffering. The promise was simple and dangerous at the same time. When the Messiah comes, you will know, because the world will no longer look the same. That is the standard. Not belief, not devotion, not internal transformation. The standard was change you could not ignore. Which brings us to the tension that refuses to go away. If Jesus was that figure, if he truly fulfilled that role, why did the structures of power remain untouched? Why did Rome stay in control? Why did the poor stay poor? Why did violence and injustice continue on schedule, as if nothing decisive had happened at all? History did not pause. It did not reset. It did not bend. And that is where the story begins to fracture, because once expectations are clear, explanations become unavoidable. Rome didn't even notice. Here is a detail that rarely gets examined because it quietly undermines the entire narrative. Rome did not react to Jesus in any meaningful way. There was no alarm, no crackdown, no emergency response. The execution of Jesus was routine, administrative, almost boring. Rome crucified him the same way it crucified countless others who stepped out of line. That matters more than people realize. Empires are paranoid by design. They are built on control, surveillance, and the rapid elimination of threats. When someone truly challenges an empire, the response is immediate and overwhelming. Leaders are hunted, movements are crushed, symbols are erased. History is full of examples of what Rome did when it sensed real danger. But with Jesus, nothing like that happened. There was no purge of followers, no military response, no political reforms, no recorded concern from Roman leadership. The machine kept moving exactly as it had the day before. Executions were common. Public crucifixions were meant to send a message. This is what happens when you disrupt order. Jesus was placed into that system and disposed of by it. And then Rome moved on. This is the part that is uncomfortable to sit with. If a Messiah had arrived, one meant to overturn the world order, Rome should have noticed something. Not belief, not devotion, not private faith, but disruption, resistance, instability, fear. Instead, Rome expanded. It conquered new territories. It crushed rebellions with the same efficiency as always. Taxes were collected, armies marched, governors ruled. Life continued under imperial logic, without interruption. Even the spread of early Christianity did not trouble Rome at first. It was seen as a minor religious variation, not a political threat, a curiosity, not a revolution. It took generations before the movement even registered as something worth managing. Empires do not overlook forces that threaten them. They respond early, violently, and decisively. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is dismissal. So, when history records no reaction, no panic, no strategic concern, it raises a possibility that is difficult to avoid. Perhaps nothing happened that required a response. Perhaps what unfolded was not a challenge to power, but something far easier for power to absorb. And that silence is not empty. It speaks volumes. Because when the strongest empire on earth barely looks up, it forces us to ask whether the event we call world-changing actually registered as such at all. The world that didn't change. Look at the world in the decades after Jesus, not through theology, but through history. Step outside sermons and into reality. Wars did not slow down. Armies did not disband. Blood still soaked the same soil it always had. Power continued to flow upward, concentrating in the hands of emperors, governors, and elites who ruled without mercy. Slavery did not end. It expanded. Human beings were still bought, sold, and worked to death across the Roman world. Children inherited chains. Families were split apart. And none of this was treated as a moral emergency. It was simply how the system functioned. Women were not liberated. They remained legally and socially subordinate, their lives governed by fathers, husbands, and masters. Their voices were still absent from courts, councils, and power. If anything, silence around their suffering remained the norm. Justice did not prevail. Courts still favored wealth and status. Punishment was brutal and public. Crucifixion itself continued as a warning, lining roads with bodies meant to terrify anyone who thought of resisting. The machinery of cruelty kept running without interruption. Even those who followed Jesus saw no immediate relief. They were not empowered. They were not protected. They were poor, marginalized, and often persecuted. Their faith did not shield them from hunger, violence, or execution. Belief did not translate into safety. Devotion did not translate into dignity. Now pause and think carefully about what this means. If the Messiah came to defeat evil, not symbolically, but concretely, why did evil remain fully operational? Why did it keep its structures, its institutions, and its momentum? Why did it continue as if nothing decisive had occurred? This is not mockery. It is not cynicism. It is observation. It is what happens when expectations collide with evidence. A transformed world leaves marks. Systems shift. Power realigns. Suffering decreases in measurable ways. History bends. But here, history kept its course. So something had to change, because the facts were stubborn. Either the promise was misunderstood, or the fulfillment was redefined. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the focus began to move. The problem was no longer the world. The problem became the human heart. Evil was no longer something to be dismantled out there. It became something to be managed within. And that shift did not happen by accident. It was a response to disappointment, a way to preserve meaning when reality refused to cooperate. Because when the world does not change, interpretation has to. And once that door opens, the story is no longer about history. It becomes about belief. When failure becomes a feature. When the expected transformation did not happen, something subtle but profound took place. The story did not end. It adjusted. The explanation shifted just enough to survive contact with reality. What was once concrete slowly became abstract, and what was once immediate was pushed safely out of reach. The kingdom was no longer something you could point to. It was no longer a rearrangement of power, law, or justice. It became invisible. Not here, not now, not measurable. The phrase "not of this world" quietly changed everything. It turned absence into intention. Victory was no longer expected in the present. It was postponed, moved forward into an undefined future, always coming, never arriving. And because it was always just ahead, it could never be disproven. Salvation followed the same path. It retreated inward. The battlefield was was no longer society but the soul. Evil was no longer something embedded in systems or institutions. It became a personal flaw. A private struggle, a matter of belief and repentance, rather than liberation and reform. Justice also moved. Courts and laws no longer needed to be fair, because true justice was promised later, in another realm, after death. Suffering here became temporary by definition, even when it lasted a lifetime. Hope was no longer something that demanded evidence. It became something you were praised for holding without it. This shift solved a problem. The world had not changed, but the meaning of change had. What once required results now required faith. And faith, by design, does not ask for proof. It asks for trust, in spite of its absence. This is the critical turn. The lack of evidence was no longer a weakness. It became a virtue. Doubt became a test. Uncertainty became devotion. The very thing that once would have disqualified the claim now validated it. But here is the strange part that often goes unnoticed. This reinterpretation only works after disappointment. It only makes sense once expectations have failed. You do not start with an invisible kingdom when people are suffering under visible oppression. You arrive there when the visible solution never appears. This is not unique to religion. It is a human pattern. When reality refuses to confirm a promise, the promise is reshaped, so reality can no longer challenge it. Meaning is preserved by moving it beyond reach. And once that happens, the story changes forever. It is no longer about what happened, it is about what you believe happened. No longer about history, about loyalty. Failure did not end the message, it refined it. It made it resilient, untouchable. Because a claim that cannot be tested cannot be defeated. The psychology of disappointed hope. Humans are remarkably skilled at protecting meaning, especially when that meaning has carried them through suffering. Hope is not just an idea, it becomes an emotional investment. Identity forms around it, community forms around it. And once that happens, letting go feels like losing more than a belief. It feels like losing yourself. So when a prophecy fails, people rarely abandon it immediately. That would require admitting that years of longing, sacrifice, and trust were misplaced. Instead, the mind looks for a way to keep the story alive, not by denying reality outright, but by reshaping the promise so reality can no longer threaten it. First, the expectation is adjusted. What was once concrete becomes flexible. Then, it is spiritualized. The outcome is no longer something that needs to appear in the world. It lives in another dimension, one that cannot be measured or falsified. Next, it is delayed. The fulfillment is still coming, just not yet. Always soon, never now. Finally, the meaning is reinterpreted. The original goal quietly fades into the background, replaced by a deeper, more mysterious purpose. If the Messiah did not fix the world, then fixing the world was never the point. If suffering continued, then suffering must serve a higher plan. This process is not deception, it is psychological survival. Admitting disappointment creates pain, confusion, and disorientation. Redefining reality offers relief. It allows people to keep hope without confronting failure directly. And this pattern is not unique to religion. It appears in movements, ideologies, and personal relationships. When expectations collapse, reinterpretation steps in. The promise does not disappear. It transforms. What makes this pivot so powerful is that it feels like insight rather than retreat. It feels deeper, wiser, more mature. The believer is not giving up. They are evolving. But in practice, the standard of evidence has quietly shifted. The question is no longer, did this change the world? It becomes, did it change you? And once that move is made, the original claim no longer needs to be defended. It has been replaced. This psychological pivot explains more than theology ever could. It explains why failed expectations can produce stronger belief, why disappointment can deepen devotion, and why stories often become most resilient at the moment they should have ended. Because when hope is disappointed, the mind does not always let go. Sometimes it rewrites the promise so it can never be disappointed again. Why suffering continued unchallenged. Here is a quiet but crucial detail that is often missed because it sounds uncomfortable when said out loud. Christianity did not end suffering, it gave suffering meaning, and that distinction changes everything. Pain was no longer just something to escape or resist, it became something to endure with purpose. Suffering was reframed as virtuous. The more you bore, the more faithful you were seen to be. Endurance became holy, obedience became admirable, acceptance became strength. This shift had enormous consequences. When suffering is interpreted as part of a divine plan, it no longer demands immediate correction. It no longer needs to be confronted at the level of systems, laws, or power. It becomes personal, interior, spiritual. Reward was not denied, it was postponed. Not here, not now, later, in another life. In another realm where all accounts would be settled. That promise changed how people related to injustice in the present. If everything is temporary and heaven is guaranteed, then what you endure today becomes less urgent. This framework did not threaten empires, it soothed them. A population trained to endure suffering with patience is easier to govern than one demanding structural change. Hope redirected upward does not challenge power on the ground. This is not speculation. History shows it repeatedly. Empires fear rebellion, not resignation. They fear organized resistance, not inward devotion. A belief system that encourages people to accept their condition while waiting for future justice is remarkably compatible with long-term control. Ask yourself the uncomfortable question. If injustice is temporary and ultimate justice is assured elsewhere, why risk everything to challenge it now? Why rebel against a system that can only harm the body when the soul is promised eternal reward? This does not mean early Christians consciously supported oppression. Many did not. But the structure of the belief worked regardless of intent. It redirected energy away from transformation and toward endurance. And once you see that, the unchanged world begins to make sense. The absence of visible transformation was not a failure of the system. It was part of how the system functioned. Suffering was no longer a problem to solve, it was a condition to survive. When suffering is sanctified, injustice can persist without collapse. And that is why the world could remain exactly as it was, while belief spread across it. A message that survived by adapting. None of this means that Jesus had no influence. He clearly did. Ideas attributed to him spread far beyond the place and time in which he lived. His words were remembered, repeated, and eventually organized into a movement that outlived empires. But influence and fulfillment are not the same thing, and confusing them blurs an important distinction. Influence is about reach. Fulfillment is about results. An idea can travel widely without accomplishing what it originally promised. History is full of movements that endured by changing shape rather than delivering outcomes. Christianity survived, not because it immediately reshaped the world, but because it adapted to a world that did not change. When external transformation failed to appear, the definition of success quietly shifted. The measure was no longer political liberation or social justice. It became internal conversion. The goal was no longer to remake society, it was to remake the individual. Not laws, but hearts. Not institutions, but beliefs. This move was subtle, but it was decisive. It lowered the standard of visible change while expanding the reach of the message. A transformed heart is impossible to disprove. It leaves no universal benchmark. One person's inner peace cannot be measured against another's suffering. And because the transformation was internal, it could be claimed anywhere, under any conditions, without contradiction. This adaptability made the message portable. It could survive under empire, under persecution, under poverty, and later under power itself. It did not need favorable conditions to claim success. Wherever belief existed, fulfillment could be declared. Over time, this redefinition hardened into doctrine. The world was not expected to change quickly or at all. What mattered was faith, obedience, and personal salvation. The original tension between promise and reality faded as generations were born into the adjusted story. And this explains everything that followed. Why the movement could grow without dismantling injustice. Why it could coexist with slavery, hierarchy, and empire. Why it could be both comforting to the oppressed and useful to those in power. The message did not survive because it conquered the world. It survived because it learned how to live inside it unchanged. The question that still lingers. So we return to the question because it refuses to disappear no matter how many times it is avoided. If Jesus was the Messiah, if he truly fulfilled that role, why did the world look the same afterward? Not slightly improved, not slowly healing, but structurally unchanged. This question is uncomfortable because it cuts through layers of tradition and goes straight to outcome. It does not ask what people believed. It asks what actually happened. It does not argue theology. It observes history. Maybe the promise was not fulfilled. That possibility is difficult because it suggests that hope was misplaced. Or maybe the promise was rewritten after the fact, reshaped to survive disappointment and preserve meaning. That option explains a great deal, but it raises its own questions about honesty and interpretation. Or maybe the promise was never what people later claimed it to be. Maybe expectations grew over time. Maybe later generations projected cosmic significance onto a message that was originally smaller, narrower, or different altogether. Memory has a way of expanding stories when they become sacred. Whichever answer you lean toward, none of them are trivial. Each one challenges something deeply held, and that is precisely why the question matters. It does not allow easy comfort. It does not reward passive acceptance. It demands clarity. This question has survived for centuries because it exposes the gap between expectation and reality. And gaps like that force choices. You either confront them, explain them, or ignore them. But once seen, they cannot be unseen. There is power in asking questions that risk certainty, not to destroy meaning, but to refine it, not to mock belief, but to test its foundations. Because honesty costs something, comfort asks for nothing. And when faced with a story that claims to change everything, the most honest response is to look at the world and ask, did it? That question lingers not because it is hostile, but because it is human. This isn't about belief versus disbelief. It's about expectation versus reality. A Messiah who changes everything should leave fingerprints on history, not just on hearts. When the world stays the same, we owe it to ourselves to ask why. Not with anger, not with fear, but with clarity. Progress doesn't come from postponing justice. It comes from demanding it here. If this made you pause, if it made you question what you were taught, stay curious. And if you value truth over tradition, subscribe.